Hello and welcome to another session in our teaching series Hidden Facts in Biology. In this video, we'll be looking at nervous coordination, and under this, we'll be talking about the neuron and neuronic transmissions. First of all, let's look at the neuron. By way of introduction, I want to say the nervous system consists of millions of neurons. Neurons are known as nerve cells. The neuron or nerve cell is the basic unit of the nervous system, and this basic unit is responsible for the transmission of impulses or signals within the body. We can therefore say that the neuron is the structural and functional unit of the nervous system. The neuron or nerve cell consists of three main parts. These are the cell body, the dendrite, and the axon. Some neuron or nerve cells, however, have a structure known as the dendron. So we'll talk about these different parts individually. First, let's look at the cell body. The cell body consists of nucleus and cytoplasm. Present in the cytoplasm are nucleus granules, and these nucleus granules are rich in ribonucleic acid or RNA, and this RNA help to manufacture protein. The next structure we look at is the dendrites. The dendrites are short cytoplasmic filaments that conduct impulses, which could be messages or signals, to the cell body. The next structure we'll talk about is the axon. The axon is also known as the nerve fiber. It is that portion of the nerve cell or neuron which carries impulses away from the cell body. Most axons of vertebrates are enclosed in a myelin sheath, and this myelin sheath has a functional peculiarity, and the functional peculiarity is that it increases the speed of impulse transmission. Axons with myelin sheaths are said to be myelinated, while those without myelin sheath are unmyelinated. Myelin sheaths have a covering, and this covering is the neurolema. The neurolema are part of another cell called the Schwann cells. They are not part of the neuron itself. At intervals, myelin sheaths are interrupted by constrictions. It's known as the node of Ranvier. The next structure we look at is the dendron. The dendron is a long fiber that conducts impulse from a synapse to the cell body. Now, what is a synapse? Where two nerves meet is a nerve junction called a synapse. At a synapse, the motor end plate of the axon joins with the dendrite of the following neuron, but the two nerve cells do not touch each other. They leave a gap, and this gap is called a synaptic gap. So synapses allow signals to pass through two different nerves. Now we'll look at the structure of a neuron to better understand the different parts we have spoken about before. So this is the structure of a neuron. So in this structure, we can see the different labeled parts. The first part that is labeled there is the dendrites, and we say that the dendrites are short cytoplasmic filaments that helps to conduct impulses or messages to the body. The next labeled part there is the cell body, which consists of the cytoplasm and the nucleus. And we can see some dots in the cytoplasm. Those are nucleus granules, which are rich in RNA, and they help in the manufacture of protein. The next structure there is the axon, and we said the axon carries impulses away from the cell body. You can see it's coming from the cell body. And further, we've said that most axons in vertebrates are enclosed in a sheath known as the myelin sheath. So that's the myelin sheath. And the function of this myelin sheath is that it helps to increase the speed of impulse transmission. That is to say, nerves that have myelin sheath, in other words, that are myelinated, have a greater speed of impulse transmission
than those nerves that are unmyelinated or do not possess a myelin sheath. Remember, we also said that myelin sheath at intervals are interrupted by constrictions, and these constrictions are known as the node of Ranvier. So that is the node of Ranvier labeled there, and from there we can see this nerve or this neuron going to the muscle fibers through the motor end plate. So this is the structure of the neuron. The next subject we'll be looking at is the classification of neurons. There are three types of neurons, and these are the sensory neuron, also known as the afferent neuron. We have the motor neuron, which is also known as the efferent neuron, and then there is the intermediate neuron, also known as the association neuron, relay neuron, or interneuron. So we'll look at them differently. The first one we have is the sensory or afferent neuron. The sensory or afferent neuron transmits impulses from sensory cells towards the central nervous system, which is the spinal cord and brain. The dendrites of the sensory neuron are connected to the sensory cells, while the axon is connected to other neurons. The next neuron we'll look at is the motor or efferent neuron. The motor or efferent neuron transmits impulses away from the central nervous system to the effector organ, for example, the muxus or the glands. The dendrites are connected to an intermediate neuron, while the axon of the motor or efferent neuron is connected to an effector. The next neuron we look at is the intermediate or relay or association, or we can also call it a connector neuron. The intermediate neuron joins the sensory neuron with the motor neuron. That is, it transmits impulses from one neuron to the other within the central nervous system. Both their axons and their dendrites are connected to other neurons. We'll look at a diagram that will show us the different type of neurons. So this diagram shows the different type of neurons and how they conduct impulses from the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system. So the first one we are going to be talking about is the sensory neuron. I want us to take a look at the direction of impulse of this sensory neuron, the direction that the impulse flows. We can see that the impulse is flowing from the sensory receptors in skin towards the central nervous system. The Bible said that the sensory neuron transmits impulse from the sensory cell towards the central nervous system. So that is the sensory neuron there that we have. All other parts that are labeled, we have spoken about them, including the axon, the cell body, and the dendron. So that after the sensory neuron, the next neuron we'll talk about is the intermediate or relay or association neuron. This intermediate neuron, it joins the sensory neuron with the motor neuron. We can see the direction of impulse of the neuron, that the impulse is actually coming from the central nervous system to the motor neuron, and it's connecting the sensory neuron to the motor neuron. Now, the next neuron we look at is the motor neuron. Another thing I want you to take note of is still the direction of impulse. We can see that the impulse is going towards the muxus, which is the effector organ. So, in other words, the motor neuron transmits impulses away from the central nervous system to the effector organ. So, these are the different types of the neuron that we have. However, they can also be mixed neuron. A mixed neuron is a neuron that has both sensory and motor function. The mixed neuron are also known as the mixed nerve. All the nerves connected to the spinal cord are mixed nerves, and there are 31 in number in man. We have looked at the neuron and its different types. Let us talk about ionic transmission now. Ionic transmission is talking about the transmission of impulses along a neuron. And this transmission is by electrochemical means. When we say electrochemical means, we mean that it involves both electrical and chemical transmission. And the mechanism of transmission of impulses through a nerve fiber is in 3 phases. And these 3 phases include the following. Number 1, the resting potential. Number 2, the action potential. Number 3, the repolarization phase. The transmission of nerve impulses involves fiber transmission, which is electrical, and transmission through synapse, which is chemical, and that is why it is an electrochemical process. Now let's talk about the individual phases. The first phase is the resting potential phase. The resting potential stage is the stage when no impulse is passing through the nerve fiber. A nerve fiber is electrically polarized, that is, it has positive charges, with a net positive charge outside and a net negative charge inside the cell membrane. There are more potassium ions inside than outside, and more sodium ion outside than inside the membrane. And in this state, where no impulse or messages or transmission is passing through the nerve fiber, the nerve fiber is said to be at a resting potential. The next stage we'll look at is the stage of the action potential. The action potential stage. Now, when a dendrite receives a stimulus, the beginning of the axon is stimulated and becomes temporarily depolarized. And this depolarization is by the inward flow of sodium ions and the outward flow of potassium ion. This is going to cause stimulation of the adjacent part of the axon, which in turn becomes depolarized. As this continues, depolarization occurs from one end of the axon to the other, and the nerve fiber is said to be at an action potential. The next stage is the stage of repolarization or the repolarization phase. Before the onset of the repolarization phase, the inner side of the membrane of the nerve fiber is electropositive relative to the outside. Soon after the transmission of the impulse, the resting potential is re-established. The transmission of nerve impulses is unidirectional, it moves in one direction, and it obeys the all or none law. The all or none law states that if the intensity of the stimulus is below a definite threshold, that is a definite value, the nerve fiber is not stimulated at all. And if the stimulus is up to or above the threshold or the given value, the nerve fiber is stimulated to a full action potential. So these are the 3 stages involved in the electrical transmission of the impulse along an axon. We'll show a diagram to further illustrate this point. So this diagram shows the neuronic transmission or the phases of the electrical transmission of the impulse along an axon. What happens here is that when a neuron is at rest, or we say polarized, both inside and outside the cell membrane, we have different concentration of potassium and sodium ions. That is, as we can see, the sodium ions in the first diagram there are outside the cell membrane, and they are in essence. This condition will make the cell membrane inside negatively charged and outside positively charged. We can see that by the negative sign, which is inside the cell membrane in the first diagram there, and the positive sign outside. So now, when an impulse is transmitted along a neuron, the cell membrane becomes permeable to sodium ions, and that means it becomes depolarized. And we can see the depolarized section of the membrane there. Thus, what happens is that sodium ions are pumped inside the cell membrane, and potassium ions will come outside. The cell membrane is now depolarized, with inside the cell membrane being positively charged and outside being negatively charged. A sodium potassium pump located in the cell membrane will now move excess sodium ions outside and the excess potassium ion inside the cell membrane, and this is going to restore the original resting stage of the neuron. So this is what happens in the electrical transmission of an impulse along an axon. So now we are going to be talking about the chemical transmission of impulse by chemical means. We have said earlier that the transmission of nerve impulse across a synapse is by chemical means. How does this happen? The synaptic knobs at the tip of the end plate fibers secrete a chemical substance, and this chemical substance is called acetylcholine. Acetylcholine will diffuse across the synaptic gap and stimulate the dendrites of the postsynaptic neuron. The second neuron continues the transmission of impulse. An enzyme called the cholinesterase enzyme renders the acetylcholine inactive, because if it doesn't render it active, the acetylcholine is going to accumulate at the synaptic gap, and this is very dangerous to human health, as it is going to cause continuous stimulation of the dendrites. So the cholinesterase enzyme is going to what renders the acetylcholine inactive, and what it does is that it breaks the acetylcholine into an acetyl component and a choline component. Now let's talk about the functions of the neuron or nerve cells. The function of the neuron is as follows. Number one, it conducts impulses to the brain, and this is the function of the sensory neuron. Number two, the intermediate neurons integrate the reflex actions. Number three, the autonomic nerves helps to keep us active. That is both the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nerves. Number four, the motor neurons conduct impulses to the sense organs. And the last but not the least, neurons enables us to be aware of our environment. This brings us to the end of our teaching in this video. Now we are going to be taking some questions as usual. First example, neurons that receive stimuli from the body or internal organs are called A. Sensory neurons, B. Efferent neurons, C. Motor neurons, D. Relay neurons. The answer to this question is A. That is because neurons that receive stimuli from the body or internal organs are called the sensory neurons or the efferent neurons. Our next question, it says, each neuron consists of the following structures except A. Cell body, B. Dendrites, C. Axon, D. White matter. White matter is not a part of the neuron. A typical neuron consists of a cell body, dendrites, and an axon. That means the answer to this question is D. The next question, it says, impulses are conducted towards the nerve cell through the A. myelin sheath, B. dendron, C. axons, D. synaptic node. The answer to this question is B, and that is because impulses are conducted towards the nerve cells through the dendron. Note that impulses are conducted away from the nerve cell through the axon. Our next question, it says, in a mammal, stimulus is transferred from the receptor muscle to the central nervous system through the A. motor neurons, B. effector muscle, C. dendrites, D. sensory neurons, E. synapses. The answer to this question is D. That is because stimulus is transferred from the receptor muscle to the central nervous system through the sensory neurons or efferent neurons. Our next question, it says, which of the following neurons is involved in the conduction of nerve impulses? A. calcium ion, B. potassium ion, C. hydrogen ion, D. magnesium ion. In the conduction of nerve impulses, two ions are involved, and that is the potassium ion and the sodium ion. and that makes our answer to be B, potassium ion. So our next question, it says the two key cations involved in the action potentials of nervous transmission are A, sodium and potassium ion, B, sodium ion and iron 2 ion, C, iron 2 ion and magnesium ion, D, magnesium ion and potassium ion. First of all, I would love to say that cations are positively charged ion, while anions are negatively charged ion. So the cations that are involved in nervous transmission are the sodium ion and the potassium ion, and that makes our answer to be A. So this brings us to the end of our examples. Now we are going to be taking some exercises. These exercises were taken from our book, Hidden Facts in Biology, and the answers have also been provided in the book. You can get either the soft copy or the hard copy to check if your answers are correct after you have tried them. Thank you for listening.